Oh yeah, that'll be 2. The rest are
Okay. Well, it looks like this is going to be a somewhat more intimate audience. You guys are going to get to learn some stuff that nobody else will. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you to Ernor's Hardcore History Hour. If any of you have seen the show Tipsy Time Machine,
they haven't.
This is not that. This is a panel where basically Uncle Kage and I will stand up. Well, we're not going to stand, we're going to sit because it's very early in the morning. And I know this old man is tired.
I don't have coffee.
Sorry, I think they fixed that. But we will warm up with a couple stories of alcohol. How does that sound?
Okay.
All right. So, one story in particular that I always like to share with people because it imparts a very good lesson actually comes from the Civil War. The year is 1863. It is the Battle of Chattanooga. On January 30th, the 115-pound General Sheridan rides upon his horse with his men. He reaches into his ornate wool pocket, the pocket of his ornate wool coat, and pulls out a flask of good Tennessee whiskey, and he toasts the gunners of the Confederate Army stationed on the hills above him. And he says, "Here's to you, boys." Well, the gunners didn't take very kindly to that, and they proceeded to open fire on the general and his men, spattering them with dirt, throwing Sheridan from his horse, and of course, destroying his flask. He got up, dusted himself off, and said, "Gentlemen, that was unjust. I'll take your guns for that." And then he proceeded to take their guns and slaughter half of them in the process. The moral of the story is, you don't fuck with a man's flask.
We're basically telling stories that happen to other people. This is the difference between this and my story hour. But I've got a bit of a connection. I have shaken hands with men who fought in World War I. They have shaken hands with men who fought in the American Civil War, and they had shaken hands with men who fought in the American Revolution. So I am 3 steps removed from the American Revolution. I got lots of stories. Some directly from veterans. Oh, certainly. Some directly from the veterans, some from people who heard them directly from the veterans, but they are all within 3 steps. There are all sorts of tales that come out of war, and sometimes you wonder, is this real? Is it not real? The fog of war. So, a lot of times you have to take these stories as possibly apocryphal, but damn, it's a good story. When the Japanese Imperial Navy attacked Pearl Harbor in World War II, or at the beginning of World War II, the outset, there was a story that was told to me by an old gentleman that at Henderson Field, which was the Army Air Corps, they weren't calling it the Air Force at the time, the Army Air Corps field, was completely unprepared, as was everybody else. The bugler was so rattled when he saw foreign aircraft dropping bombs, he forgot the bugle call for assembly. He couldn't remember what it was. So, in desperation, he blew "Pay, muster. Come get paid." And that brought the guys running. So, improvise, overcome, adapt.
Well, when it comes to improvising, I'm going to share a story from my family history with you guys. That's one I've actually wanted to tell for a while, and I never had a panel where it quite fit. This is a story about a young man whose name is Chuck. Chuck was born in the year 1925. His parents came to America directly from Finland. He's a second-generation immigrant. And he decided in 1944 that he wanted to serve his country, damn it. All of his friends were going off to fight in the war. They were going to do their part. They were going to be manly men. And he went down to the recruiter's office and said, "Sir, I'd like to join up." And they tested him and said, "Well, you don't quite muster up." Well, he had to try a couple of times. Finally, he did manage to overcome one little stumbling block and did make it onto the base. So they sent him all the way down to Texas. I will remind you that this gentleman came from Pennsylvania in a small town just outside of Lake Erie that he had never left before. So he was very unused to Texas, and it made him a little bit grouchy. And one day he forgot to salute a superior officer and got into a tussle with this man. Well, luckily, the officer was found at fault. That's one part of the story that Chuck was never quite clear on how this was managed, but he was sent to the local doctor for basically a checkup. And as he was measuring Chuck's abilities, he said, "Okay, I need you to pass a simple eye exam." And when the chart was put in front of Chuck and he had to read it, the ophthalmologist looked from him to the chart, back again, and said, "Son, absolutely none of those guesses were correct. How the hell did you pass muster?" And he had to admit, "Well, sir, I memorized the eye chart." And that's how he got into the Army. Well, of course, he couldn't remain on active combat duty, so they had him stay around the barracks for several months, writing letters home to his mother. I am actually lucky enough to have all of the letters that he wrote home to his mother and all of the letters that she wrote to him. It's an incredible treasure trove if you're looking for the experiences of a man who served in the war but never went overseas, which there are actually a great many men who filled that role. And one day, while serving in Austin, he once more was called into the recruiter's office and told, "Chuck, we're going to move you to a new barracks. You're being sent all the way to Oklahoma." Now, this actually wasn't very unusual, because during the war, you have to keep a certain number of men stationed in any barracks at any given time, and a group of men had just been sent out overseas to fight the Germans. Well, that meant that the base in Oklahoma wasn't going to have the quota that it needed, so they were going to steal some men from Texas and put them in Oklahoma just so they could make sure that the base got the money that they were due. Some things never change. And so everything was piled under the train. All of his mates were ready to go. And then at the very last minute, the action was deferred. Well, no one bothered to tell this to the baggage handlers, so every single thing that Chuck owned was sent to Oklahoma. You can imagine how difficult this was for him, because it meant he was down to just one uniform. And all of his civilian clothes were gone.
Did they have United Airlines in those days?
No, they might as well have been. I mean, they had something worse. They had the train.
Yeah.
And so Chuck found himself in a bit of a dilemma, because you can't have one uniform, and you can't not have a pair of civilian clothes. So he had to beg, borrow, and in one case steal the necessary items needed to go into town and buy a new set of civilian duds. He secured a weekend pass to go into Austin, Texas, and go shopping, basically. This is from his commanding officer. He was sent out into Austin, and he had a wonderful time. He wrote his mother that he went to a USO show with a couple of girls. They went swimming. He showed them a thing or two in a Jeep, which I guess that was his nice way of saying, "Yes, Mom, I'm still a nice American man who's not doing anything forward, but I am still expressing my manhood." And when he got back to the base, he couldn't find anyone in his barracks. The place was completely empty. And he wandered around for about half an hour until he managed to find an MP and said, "What the hell is going on?" And this gentleman took one look at Chuck and said, "Where the hell are you? Your unit is gone." Every single person in that unit had just been picked up, put on a boat, shipped out, and sent to the Battle of the Bulge, where most of that unit was killed. So a clerical error saved my grandfather from going overseas to the Battle of the Bulge, or probably taking a German bullet. Who says the government who says the government's mistakes can't be good sometimes?
I had the exquisite pleasure and honor of meeting an elderly Japanese gentleman who had a wonderful story to tell. Through an interpreter, of course, he didn't speak any English. But he told a remarkable tale to me that he had been a teenager in Japan in 1945, on paper too young to go and fight, but the Imperial Japanese Navy came knocking on the door and said, "Guess what, you're drafted." At that point, Japan was in desperate state. They assigned him to a flying unit. He was given a few hours of classroom training, how to operate an aircraft, They put him into a peach crate, which they rocked back and forth a few times. That was his training. And they put him into a bomber laden with bombs. His job was to fly into the first American vessel that he was able to find and give his life to the Emperor. He wasn't very good at it because he got shot down. Landed in the water, and the Americans kindly picked him up. He was taken in as a prisoner and spent the remainder of the war, and for some time after the war, in a prison camp on a beach in Hawaii, which he said was not the worst fate that could befall a man. Sure, there was the, oh, I have dishonored my family, but I'm on a beach in Hawaii. My job is to lie on the beach all day and just not do anything. He said he wanted to stay a prisoner, but they made him go back to Japan. And when he got back to Japan, it was a ruined country. He went back and forth doing odd jobs. And he got a job on the back lot of a film studio. And he was a stalwart young fellow, big for Japanese guys, very strong, muscular. And he was just working his job someday when one of the directors came out and said, "You, come here." And he said, "Yeah." And he said, "You look strong, come with me." The director was making a new film. His name was Eiji Tsuburaya. The strong man was named Mr. Haru Nakajima, and they needed somebody who could handle a 150-kilogram rubber suit and had enough muscle that could move in it. He became the actor who portrayed Godzilla. So it was a fascinating story. The only thing about it that was a bit of a letdown was Mr. Nakajima was this tall. It's like, that's Godzilla.
I mean, why do you think they had to build the set so small?
Exactly. And considering he was big for a Japanese guy back then.
Well, I mean, you seem to know quite a bit about history. How did you? I know you're a scientist, but you're clearly a history buff. What drew you to history in the first place? What makes you continue to consume it as a hobby?
I'm a storyteller. Isn't every storyteller a historian?
No, we are all historians.
Yeah. Maybe because I've been involved around, heard the stories of people who themselves lived through history. It's just a fascination for me, things that happened before I was around. Because for most people, it's it's words on a page. It's a special on a TV show. But it's more interesting to me to hear about the personal aspects of history. One of the best history classes I ever had. Remember sitting in your history class when they make you learn about the Hawley Smoot Act and the Monroe Doctrine and the
Teapot Dome scandal.
Yeah, oh yes, that very important.
Well, no, that's a good story.
We know about the teapot. Oh, yeah, okay, it was. But the best history class I ever had was taught out of the diary of a young boy who had been a drummer in the 51st Pennsylvania Volunteers in Company A in the Civil War. He was a kid who didn't really write very well, but it was a first-hand account from the viewpoint of a 13-year-old. And some of the stories that were in there that came out of it were just jaw-dropping because you were hearing it firsthand across the sea of history. He was at the Battle of Antietam, and he described that as the rebels, R-E-B-I-L-S, he writes like people do today. As the rebels were coming forward and firing, they were just, it was surreal because they were just watching the smoke rise and they'd hear the bang. And the guy next to him commented on how the gunfire was scaring all the grasshoppers in the grass around them because they were just jumping everywhere. And then they realized that wasn't grasshoppers, that was the musket balls hitting the grass around them. And that's when they first realized that they had they had gotten themselves into something.
They're in the line of fire.
Yep. That was just a paragraph. And then the next paragraph, the last entry for the day was, got taken prisoner, Prisner. Then the cavalry come over the hill and boy I run. Now that's a hell of a lot more interesting than reading about the Hawley Smoot Act. I don't even know what the hell that is, the Hawley Smoot Act. We had to study that. Does anybody know what the Hawley Smoot Act is? Does anybody give a damn? No, I don't.
Well, there's all kinds of stuff you're told that you have to learn at school, but you don't really give a shit about. But sometimes you're lucky. Sometimes you do get a good professor.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorites was a very eccentric fellow who, his name was Professor Zook. I won't tell you his first name because he's still teaching. And if he ever sees this video, he might get angry with me.
Hi, YouTube.
Hey, Professor. And he was a very interesting gentleman. He was from the Ukraine originally. He grew up firmly entrenched in the ideology of the communist state. He earned his PhD in American colonial studies. And so he was teaching these Ukrainian students who probably couldn't give a damn about how the American Revolution was won. And eventually he was looking to move over to America, and he was brought over to Johns Hopkins University, where he then proceeded to also teach Tsarist and Soviet Union history, because he had first-hand knowledge about most of that. Well, at least the Soviet Union history. Tsarist Russian history, I mean, I don't know, I guess he could have been old enough to learn at least a little bit of that. So he came over to the States and was teaching at a university where I was studying in undergrad. He was one of the most wonderful teachers because he had very thick accent. And whenever he would talk to you, he'd get very excited. And especially when it had something to do with the culture wars of the Cold War, where he would discuss how he and his friends, for example, fell in love with music of Black Sabbath, even though the Soviet police come and say you can't listen to this, it is hateful music. And we say, why? It's because the SS in Black Sabbath will make it look like it is Nazi propaganda. But they continued to listen to it. They actually learned how to play instruments listening to Black Sabbath. And they actually got a gig on every Sunday where they would go in and play the choir music for the parishioners using their drums and electric guitars, because that meant for the rest of the week they were allowed to go into the church and use it as a practice space for their death metal band. This is also a man who, when he was in his early 20s, I want to say somewhere around early 20s, was once again drafted into the Russian military, as a lot of men of that age were. And in the 1980s, something very bad happened in Russia. Some of you who have seen a little series called Chernobyl may know what I'm gearing up towards. And Dr. Zook was called, well, he wasn't a doctor then, but Mr. Zook, well, one day a knock came at his door, and a man from the government said, Comrade Zook, your services are needed in Chernobyl. And he was sent directly to Chernobyl to help with the cleanup. And it was the surrealist thing ever to be sitting in his class, listening to him rant and rave, very, very adorably, about the music of his generation. And he would then look at his watch and say something along the lines of, okay, you have your paper, you have your assignment. You will stay home on Monday to do your assignment. I will not be here. My son come to take me to a doctor to have a checkup for injury I suffered at Chernobyl. You have a good weekend. But this guy, he was the one who actually introduced me to vodka. Because, and it was good shit too. Because we're sitting in his office. I had just turned 21, I want to say about 2 weeks ago, so it was totally okay. We're sitting in his office, and I was in the middle of writing a paper comparing Soviet Cold War film to American Cold War film. And we got really into it because he was the kind of guy who had seen all of these movies. I was, of course, raised on the 80s action movies of Rambo and Red Dawn and all these anti-communist, pro-capitalist dogma. And we got really into it, and he says, but I couldn't understand some of the motivations behind the films that the Soviet Union released in the 60s and 70s. And finally, Dr. Zook said, look, perhaps your mind is too closed off and clouded. I have a way to fix this. And he reaches into his bottom drawer, opens it up, and pulls out a bottle of Cossack vodka from Russia. It is simultaneously the worst and best thing I've ever put in my mouth that is meant to make you drunk. Because then he puts it on the desk, and then he opens up another drawer and reaches in and pulls out 2 shot glasses. And he pours us both a knock. And he says, I'm going to horribly butcher this, Здравствуйте! And we clink glasses, and we do a shot, and we continue talking. And some minutes passed, and then a few more, and we had another shot, and we continued to talk about film. And some 4 minutes passed. And I wound up staying in his office for an extra 45 minutes. And then I said, Dr. Zook, I can't stay here. I have to go home because I'm a lightweight. And he laughed and said, oh, it would not happen in Soviet Union. You go home. Rest up now, easy. I miss that man. He was a treasure.
Why not go visit him?
I mean, well, he's a bit far away, and unfortunately, I'm a legally blind man. I'm a legally blind man who can't drive because I would murder someone on the road, and then I would have to call Boozy and say, "Please give me legal advice."
Were there any bees involved in the accident?
In warfare.
If I say yes, can I blame Dragor?
In warfare, what is possibly the primary rule? Know your enemy. That's very, very necessary. I was told by a nice old British gentleman of a little dirty trick the Germans played when they were retreating. In 1944, as the Wehrmacht was pulling back into Germany, as they gave up territory, one thing that they did very commonly was they would find the nicest house in town that was still standing, and they would get to the biggest room, usually the parlor or the library, and with their bayonets they would gouge out a hole in the wall, and they would put a grenade in it and pull the pin. And very carefully they would hang a painting in front of it and hang the painting crooked. Because they knew that when the British arrived, the commander was going to take the nicest house in town as his headquarters, and when he came in, the first thing he was going to do was going to be to straighten that painting. And there were a number of British commanders who were lost because of that little practice. And it's interesting because it was predictable. The Germans knew that he's going to straighten the painting because he's British.
He can't open something. He's just got to do it.
Exactly. I would do the same thing.
I thought I would too. Are you kidding me? No, it's just like, no, well, chaps, we've come into a house and the world is hell, but at the very least we'll have some common decency around here.
Saunders, go straighten that painting. Which there might be a grenade behind.
I mean, speaking of warfare, a lot of the stories that I do quite a bit of research into the First World War. You could say it's one of my passions. I love the Great War, and I am simultaneously amazed and horrified by what the men did there, and also what they were able to withstand having done to them, and what they were able to endure. But as you pointed out, a lot of the stories that you probably hear are apocryphal. And whether it happens or not, there probably is a grain of truth in it. Now, that grain could be as small as a speck of sand, or it could be the size of a glacier. But nevertheless, the stories are worth retelling. One of the more interesting ones I read while preparing an exhibit on World War I for a museum that I used to run, and I have a couple stories. I'll tell you guys about that later. I was doing research into the early years of the war. because in order to figure out how to make an exhibit based on the later years of 1917 and 1918, I needed to find a quick and easy way to put the whole thing into context for people who had never heard about the First World War. Now, obviously there's quite a bit of literature to go over. There's several years of warfare before the United States even begins to consider getting into the war. We have 3 years of war before the U.S. even enters in 1917. And you could say that the French and the British, they learned quite a lot through fatal error that cost many, many men their lives. One of the worst battles you could ever be involved in was at a little place called Verdun. It was one of the worst places on earth to ever be. In the first 6 months of the campaign, now I say it's a campaign because the Battle of Verdun is really just a series of battles and skirmishes of increasingly bloody merit that was fought in 1916. And they're fighting over this little fort in the middle of basically nowhere, because this was near the tail end of the period where you're still operating under the Napoleonic rules of warfare, where forts are considered important. If you take the fort, you control the field of battle. Now, the Germans didn't really care about the fort. They just wanted to lure a bunch of French and British men in there so that they could turn the field, in the words of the German commander, into a meat grinder. Because the idea was that if you kill enough Frenchmen, eventually the society will collapse. Not the army, the society will collapse. And they will no longer be able to support the war effort. And so these two sides dig in their trenches. They're standing there, and they're just trading blow after blow after blow after blow. You have men fighting and dying on hills that are just mounds of mud that have no name, have no significance, and are lost within the next day. But every now and then, you get something incredible that would happen. So I told you guys about the fort in the middle of Verdun. And the Germans are still very interested in capturing it, but they could never get close enough. Well, one fateful day, a German, let's just call him Fritz, is sent up over the top of the trench. The whistle blows, and he and all of his comrades start running across the field through heavy artillery fire. And I cannot emphasize enough how horrifying this would have been, because in the First World War, men are using the kind of artillery that was reserved for battleships. They're using that on people. And it's not the impact of the actual bomb that kills you, it's all the debris that flies everywhere, because when it lands, it creates a hugely uneven shell crater that can throw rocks and wood and all kinds of particles into the air. And if you get hit by one of those, that's it. Sometimes the shockwave enough is alone to kill you. And you're running across a field that's full of these terrible shell craters that if you fall in one, it's very easy to get stuck in there, because it was always raining on the battlefield. And if you get stuck in one of these things, there's no way out. Sometimes you stay there and you die. And so Fritz is told, you're going to run across this field and try to take the fort. So he goes up over the top, he and his mates, and he's running across the field through heavy artillery fire, and a shell lands behind him. It detonates, and it lifts him up off of his feet, throws him over the wall of the fort, and he lands inside, miraculously unharmed. And he still has a pistol on him. So he gets to his feet, and he's looking around, and he can't believe his good fortune. And so he pulls his little German Luger from his pocket, and he starts going from room to room, looking for the Frenchmen, secure in the knowledge that the Germans will never be able to reach the fort. And he finds them doing what? Sitting around, drinking, and playing cards. And he goes from room to room. He captures about 40 men, ties them up, and opens the fort, and the Germans capture it without firing a single shot.
Wow.
Because the French were drinking.
Yes, and playing cards.
Go figure.
And also, I guess, because Fritz knew a guy named Chuck Jones.
Your fascination with World War I is shared by a man named Peter Jackson. Have you? Now, I do not No, and I hope you'll forgive me. I don't know how good your vision is, but have you been able to enjoy his recent project?
I have seen about half of it. I haven't found the time to finish it, but it is something that I really like, mainly because everybody thinks all he did was colorize the film. No. If you go back and look at the actual film footage from the First World War, the cameras are so primitive that it looks almost like stop-motion animation because there's fewer frames. The film quality is terrible. And Jackson, what he had to do was not only colorize the film, he had to go in and digitally smooth out every single frame to make it look like real modern-day footage.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, he hired lip readers and linguists to come in and read the lips of the men on camera so that they could understand exactly what they were saying. In the trailer, in fact, there's this very famous shot of a group of, I believe it's British soldiers.
Yes.
And they're panning across it, and you see a gentleman in the second or third row give this big goofy smile, and he turns to his other comrades and says, "Look, boys, we into pitches."
It's prissy. This guy is now the most famous World War I soldier in history because he looks like a total goop with these big ears. Just, hey, here comes boys. We're gonna be in the pictures.
He's got like
Two
kind
teeth.
of scraggly teeth. Yeah, that's what I love about this.
We might be focusing a bit on warfare, but that's where most of the stories I've been told come from veterans and such.
And that's where my passion lies as well. I'm a military historian, but I also love the social history and the economic history of the war. For example, like one of my favorite things that I didn't know before I started studying World War I was that it's the last romantic war, in a way, when it starts off in 1914, because, again, they're very much tied up in the Napoleonic concept of the war. It's a way for the young men to go out and earn glory and come home basically, in fact, I don't know how else to describe it, and basically become a magnet for the young women in town. And in order to play on that, when the casualties for the war mount dramatically, far quicker than anyone could have ever suspected because of a little thing called the machine gun that was put into wide usage during that time. Well, that meant that the British and the French especially needed something to force these young men to be recruited. And they actually instituted a government-funded plan whereby you would hire young women from small English towns to go after young men who were not enlisted in the army and to basically shame them by impugning their manhood and saying, "Why aren't you in the service? What are you, too much of a wimp?"
That's evil.
Yes. And it got to the point where enough of these, and it kind of backfired on them too, because the government eventually had to start issuing white feathers, the Order of the White Eagle, because a number of these women were going up to gentlemen and saying, "What's wrong with you? Why aren't you in the service? Are you too much of a wimp?" To hear him turn and reply, "Ma'am, I'm on furlough from the front." And that's not the kind of thing you want your men on furlough to tell mom and dad and the rest of the gentlemen who have yet to sign up.
Mm-hmm.
So they had to give these veterans who were on furlough a little pin to wear so that as a signal to the ladies, no, he's okay. He's already doing his time. You don't want to piss him off.
Some of you have met my little old mother. I'm not allowed to say how old she is because a gentleman does not do such a thing. But during World War II, in 1943 or 1944, I can't recall, all of her uncles, and there were 9 of them, had signed up basically on December 8th, 1941, like most other guys did.
Yeah.
And her favorite uncle was in the U.S. Navy, and he was assigned to a vessel called the USS Natoma Bay, a destroyer escort. And I won't go into the nitty-gritty details, but let's just say that the Natoma Bay was trying to assist another stricken vessel, the USS Princeton, when the Princeton's magazine exploded and took out pretty much both vessels. My uncle had been on deck at his duty station when the explosion came, and it blew him overboard. He was wearing the crash helmet that they had then. He was knocked unconscious. A piece of shrapnel basically pierced the front of his helmet and spun around on the inside, and he guesses the shock of that was what knocked him out. And he had his life jacket on, so when he hit the water, he was at least buoyant. And he was in the water for 3 days before he was found and picked up and taken to a hospital at Pearl Harbor. Now, meanwhile, back home, here's little Wilma in bed, listening to her radio, all quiet because she's supposed to be asleep, right? But she's listening to the news and thinking, oh boy, I'm going to find out what's going on. And here comes the report. USS Natoma Bay and USS Princeton had both gone down with all hands.
Oh my gosh.
Not the case, but at that time, the fog of war, that's what was believed. She, of course, was very upset and ran downstairs to tell the rest of the family. So she wasn't in trouble for not being in bed, and they spent about a week not knowing, because my grandfather at the time said, okay, it's not official until we get a telegram. And then a week later, a telegram came, and nobody wanted to open it. And she said the curious thing was, it was a naval telegram, but usually they were edged in black, and this one wasn't. And it took them a while to get up the courage, and it was from her Uncle Alex, saying, in the hospital, fine, weather's nice, hope all is well. And
Talk about understatement.
yeah, my dear father, let's say that of my mom's uncles, it was a family of storytellers, and he was always a little suspicious of some of the tales they came home with, because they not only sounded pretty wow, but also some of them sounded a lot like movies that had come out in the 50s. But I remember hearing this story from my Uncle Alex, and then he went to the mantelpiece and pulled down that helmet with a groove inside it, where that piece of shrapnel had gone around and gouged a groove. So I've always believed that one was true. My Uncle Andy, on the other hand, I think was full of shit. That's
Well, there's one in every family.
yeah.
So I promised to show you some, I guess, museum war stories with you guys. I used to run, for about 2.5 years, I was the executive director of my local historical society. It's the second oldest, no, it is the oldest continually running historical society in all of Indiana. It was a 3-story, I guess you'd call it an Italianate mansion in the middle of a small town. And it was kind of neat to run this space because you wouldn't think our collection was huge, but we had enough World War I material to actually put on a World War I exhibit. And our town's population is somewhere around like 15,000. So it's not that big. You wouldn't expect us to have so many relics from the First World War, especially when we only had about 500 guys who actually went overseas to serve in armed combat during that conflict. So it was interesting to run that space, but I was also tasked with being, let's say the young man on the totem pole by about 4 decades. Because when I took the job, I was 27. And it was completely staffed by a number of older ladies who were all in their 70s and 80s. And then I had to come in and tell these women who had been running the society for several years that no, I have the degree, I know what to do, you guys need to fall in line and do what I say. Well, I very quickly learned that that is not the way you handle old ladies who are used to running their museum and the way they have become accustomed. And that took some getting used to. Well, we did, from time to time, one of the interesting things about running the museum is that you get the weirdest donations from people. Because, we're a county history museum. We collect everything that has to do with the history of the county. So we'd get yearbooks. One one day a woman came up to the back of our museum and said, "I have a truck full of yearbooks." And I thought I must have misheard her. And I said, "Oh, you have a trunk?" And she said, "No, I have a truck. It is a truck bed full of about 200 old high school yearbooks." And we already had most of these, but the fun thing about a county museum is that we can collect duplicates of things and sell them for money, because we need that money to stay open and operate. So that's what we did. We spent an entire day clearing out a truck bed full of old yearbooks from about 1925 all the way up to 1994. And they sat in the back room of our secondary house, which was a smaller house that was built for, the actual mansion was made for a Union general who came back from the war and became a lawyer. Somehow I suspect Boozy would be proud. And he built the mansion for himself and his family, and then he built, several years later, he built a smaller guest house for his daughter and her husband to live in. Well, that guest house eventually became the center of our archives, where we stored all of our documents and papers and the things that we didn't have room to put on display. And most of the stuff that we get in a museum, you'll only see about maybe 10 to 15% of a museum's entire collection on display at one time. There's a reason why museums have to rotate everything. It's because we have too much shit. Oftentimes that's a good thing, because it means we get to keep things interesting, but sometimes we get weird stuff too. And I think one of the weirdest calls I ever had was from a gentleman who was 97 years old. He was calling me from a little town named Farah. And I could, or at least that's what I think it was, how it was pronounced, because this gentleman had I guess he had forgotten his teeth that morning, because I was hardly able to understand him. And what should have been a 20-minute conversation turned into a 45-minute conversation, as I struggled not only to understand him, but to make myself understood. He said, "I have a Coke bottle that was minted in your town on Christmas Eve in 1945. It was made on the day that my parents got married. I'd like to send it to the museum so that you guys can put it on display." Now that's pretty straightforward, but now imagine trying to get that out of an old gentleman with no teeth for about 20 minutes. Needless to say, I was getting a little frustrated. And then for the life of me, when I tried to give him the mailing address after getting all the pertinent information, or what we call provenance on an item, because that's one thing we have to get, is where did it come from? Who owned it? And how long did they own it for? What's the story behind it? So we don't just slap a number on it and stick it in our collection and lose all that history. We have to be able to pass it on. And so after getting all that information, I then have to get this gentleman to tell me, I have to tell him where to send it. And I cannot for the life of me get him to understand that we are on South Street. I spell it for him 12 times. I pronounce the S very, very carefully. And he still sends it to North Street. Thankfully, the postman knows us very well, because we get quite a bit of mail. And so I receive this package, and of course, I'm usually the first one there. That's part of being the executive director of a small museum, is that you're supposed to get there early so you can shovel the walk and do the laundry and do the garbage, so that when the old ladies come, they don't slip and fall and break their hip and you lose the services of somebody who has been there for 20 years while you've only been there for about a year. So after getting through all that, I can take this little package and I open it up. And I had told him, this gentleman, that he needed to pack this thing very, very carefully.
Oh no.
And he said, "Well, how should I do this?" And I said, "Well, you could use some old newspaper. There's foam cutouts that you can get to store the bottle in very easily and simply. Or you could use styrofoam packing peanuts." Well, he must not have heard the first two, and he must have misunderstood the last one. Because when I opened the box,
It was full of peanuts.
it was full of peanuts. Actual peanuts in their shells.
Well, that actually works at least.
Yeah, thankfully it actually did work. It kept it very safe, and we had a snack. No, we did not, because when I pulled those peanuts out of the box, I kept the bottle in the box long enough to point it out to my coworkers so we could have a good laugh at this gentleman's expense. And also because that day we needed something to laugh at because we had 300 children coming through and only 4 people to manage them. Sometimes those are the other fun stories that you have to deal with. Managing a superb number of children when you don't have enough people in a small space that is designed for a maximum of about a dozen people to move through at any given time.
You mentioned provenance.
Yes.
Does anybody here know the name of Jeremy Kidd? Goes by Wolf in the fandom. He is one of the proto-furries. He was a furry artist when it first began. He's still around. He's a Canadian, and he's living in the States. But he told me a wonderful, wonderful tale. Several, in fact. First off, Wolf, he is a military reenactor, and his specialty is the War of 1812.
Ooh.
And in the 1970s and 80s, he would very frequently drive back and forth across the border to do reenactments and stuff. And at one point, he was coming across the border, and in those days, it was pretty much, do you have anything to declare? And yeah, we got this and this and that. The guy would wave them on. Well, they were coming back, and for whatever reason, they typically keep the weapons that they use in Canada, and they keep the weapons they use in the States. I don't recall the rationale, but they were bringing from Canada a bunch of supplies into the U.S. And when they got to the border, this is coming into America. The guy said, "Do you have anything to declare?" And Wolf said, "Yes, we've got 12 flintlock muskets. We have 4 kegs of black powder. We have 18 4-pound cannonball. We have 2 4-pound cannon. We have," and went on. And the guy listened and said, "Do you have any fruit?" Wolf said, "No, off you go." But that's not the provenance part. Wolf had a grandfather that was a veteran. And he took his grandfather to, someone can correct me, the military war museum is, I think it's in Ottawa, it doesn't matter, a Canadian museum where they had a World War I display. And he figured Grandpa would get a kick out of that. So they're walking around and everything, and at one point Grandpa kind of stopped, and Wolf was looking at something, probably the cannon and the cannonballs and things. And he turned around and was a little horrified. They had a beautiful, restored Newport fighter aircraft that was behind a little rope and everything. And Wolf saw that his grandfather, very painfully, was climbing over the rope. And before he could stop him, Grandpa went up and started doing this on the plane. And Wolf ran up and said, "Grandpa, don't do that." And the museum guard came over and said, "Excuse me there, buddy, what do you think you're doing?" And Grandpa said, "Well, this is my plane." And the guard said, "You flew one of these?" He said, "No, I flew this one." And the guard said, "Don't move." And he ran away, and he came back with the museum director and a video camera.
Yes, that is
And
what you
basically
do.
said, "Start talking." They still have that video.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Wow.
Wow.
I am going to have to
I got
excuse myself,
chills.
Ernor. I got something coming up at the top of the hour, and they've got me scheduled so tightly, I really got to go to the bathroom before I do that.
So do what you got to do. I
will.
can
Trust
entertain
me. But thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Scott Bailey. Go ahead. In that sort of that same vein, the thing that really keeps me coming back to history, one of the reasons that I love it, especially working in a museum, are some of the personal connections that I get to make with people, especially the folks who would come to the. We got a lot of people who came specifically to see the World War I exhibit when I put it together, and it was the first one I had ever done by myself. I was very proud of it. And every now and then we got folks who made an unexpected connection with the stuff we had on display. We had a family who came in from out of town, but they had lived in Newcastle for a while. And they had familial roots there. And I was taking them through the museum, and I was showing them all of the general's old house and a lot of the old antiques that we had gathered over the last 113 years that we had been going, because it's full of these wonderful old, I guess you call them old antique wooden furnishings. The ceilings are about 12 feet tall, and you get these pieces of furniture that are so heavy we would need a team of men to move them, because they're made in an era where once you put something down, it doesn't move, because that house is your forever house. And we had a lot of fun, pointing out some of the old fixtures and things. And finally, we get to the World War I exhibit, which they were very excited to see, because the father of the group was a World War I historian, an amateur one. He was an enthusiast. And so I'm showing them all the different photographs. We actually ended up having quite a large collection of photographs of men who went off to fight in the war. And over on one side of the room, it was only about half the size of this space here. Over in one corner, we had a little tiny photograph that was about this big of the first dozen men from the town who went off to fight in the war, sitting on the front of the courthouse steps. And so I'm leading them around the room and pointing out different things, and all of a sudden, the woman stops. And she turns, and she takes a little look closer at the picture, and she says, "Oh my God, that's my grandfather.
Wow.
I didn't know he served." And it turns out she recognized him because the picture was the only one that they had of him, but it was a small, cropped, and enlarged version of just his face.
Wow.
So she recognized him and knew that he had served. And we were actually able to go back into our records, pull out some of his enlistment history, and figure out where he served. He was a young man who had signed up to serve in the Army at age 17. Now, of course, that was illegal at the time, so he had to get his parents' permission. And he was sent all the way up to the post office in Indianapolis to enlist at the time. And then he was sent off to train. And he joined the Marines. And he was sent overseas to serve in France. Now, the American troops had an extremely tough time of it in France when they were sent overseas, because they were called doughboys for a reason. Well, number one, the war broke out in 1914, and it took the Americans 3 years to rise to the occasion. Like dough. Nobody said the puns were clever. I enjoy them. But they were called doughboys because even with 6 months of training stateside, when they got overseas, they were still soft. They were dying in numbers that the British and the French hadn't seen since the first years of the war, when nobody knew what they were doing. Nobody knew how to handle or adapt to tactics using stuff like flamethrowers and grenades and machine guns. And so her grandfather was thrust into an American unit. They shipped him out overseas, and they gave him another 6 months of training with British and French gunners before he was sent to a little place called Chateau Thierry. And it was the battlefield near another famous site called Belleau Wood. And it's one of the most famous American battle sites in the American military history, especially for the Marines. It's where the Marines earned their name, earned their mascot, the Bulldog, because, or at least it's said, that the American Marines fought so hard that the Germans said, the Americans, they fight like the hounds of hell. Now, of course, we have no way to confirm that, but it makes a good story, and it gives the Marine Corps a little bit more of a boost. And so he was thrust into one of the most dangerous battles that the Marines would ever fight during the First World War, and he was injured. And he was given the Bronze Star. Of course, we didn't have that, but we were able to find all of his records and let them know that he had served, because it was a case where they knew he had done something, but he would never talk about it. He would never mention it. They knew he had served his country in some way, but he would never. He was like my great-grandfather. He never wanted to talk about what he had done. My great-grandfather actually served with Patton in Africa, and some of you. How many of you guys have seen the movie Patton? Mm-hmm. Okay, there is a scene where they're in the middle of the desert, and some of you, anybody of you who know Patton, knows that Patton was a very very strict religious man. He wanted a sermon every Sunday for his troops. And there's a scene in the film where all of his troops are gathered in an ancient, I want to say, a Greek or Roman temple somewhere in the sands of Africa or Upper Egypt, and they're holding mass while the Germans and Americans are flying overhead, back and forth, bombing the crap out of everything. And it turns out that the priest holding the sermon that day was my grandfather.
Ooh.
And that story is that character holding the sermon in the movie was based off of him.
Wow.
And I didn't know that, unfortunately, until after he died. But and he never wanted to talk about that, which is something that can be frustrating. But at the same time, you've got to understand that for a lot of these guys, it was very traumatic. But there are other times where you're lucky enough to meet a gentleman who served, and you get to make their day. Several years ago, I was working for the Indiana Historical Society, the Central Society of Indiana, where we collect all of the state's history that doesn't go to the county historical societies. And we have a program called National History Day, where we go from school to school and from region to region, and we organize projects and essays and videos. It's a way for the kids in Indiana to flex their muscles, to learn how to make documentaries, how to conduct research using primary and secondary sources. Basically, it's a means for them to take all of the tools that they've been learning, hopefully learning in history class, and to put them to use in a practical way that can benefit their community. And I had the fortune of being handed a huge stack of essays, because we happened to be understaffed at the time. And while I was technically the lead tour guide, whenever I had downtime, I was instructed to go through about 200 essays and read them and give feedback. Well, as you can imagine, that got a little boring and tedious after a while, but every now and then something would jump out at me. And I got an essay from a little boy, let's call him George, and his grandfather had served in the Second World War. And he was writing about how his grandfather's experiences living through the age of, I guess the age of the atom. Because when he was first drafted, he was told that they were going to be sent overseas to invade Japan. And they were expected to lose about 1 million men. It was not going to be pretty. It was going to be an extremely long, bloody conflict. They expected it to go for at least another 2 to 3 years if they had to actually invade Japan. But then, of course, the bomb was dropped. And the essay that George wrote was all about his grandfather's reaction to the bomb and how he thought it was a good thing because it had actually saved his life. Well, with one thing and another, I managed to winnow down the essays, and I was able to interview several of these young men as they came up and got to tell me about their stories at various conferences. And it got to, I think I'd been doing this for about 3 months. And I was on very little sleep at the time. I was a little bit cranky. And I hadn't really had time to eat anything more than a banana for lunch. So I come back in, I sit down, and I'm trying to be patient. I'm trying to remind myself that I need to be impartial to these kids. I need to uplift them. I need to give them something to strive for. And in comes George. And he sits down, and I get to talk to him about his story. And I told him that his essay was one of the better ones that I had read, of the 200 plus that I had to go through. And he actually ended up going on to the state finals. Well, once everything is all said and done, some of the kids get medals, some of them get awards. But our job at the very end of the day is to stand in the hallway with about 500 children and pass out their essays and make sure that everybody gets theirs if they want to take it home and read our feedback and make any kind of adjustments before they go on to the finals. And so that was the end of my day. And as I'm sitting there, and I'm very tired, and I'm very annoyed, and I've got a massive throbbing headache over my right eye, up comes George. And with him comes a little old man who's about this tall, and is stooped over in his walker, and he's got a little veteran's hat perched on his head. And I say, "Are you George's grandfather?" And he says, "Yes, I am." And I say, "Sir, I just wanted to shake your hand to tell you that your grandson wrote one of the best essays I've read for this competition, and he's going to the finals." And this man, who had served his country and looked like he was very much in need of more in need of a nap than I was, his face lit up. He wore a huge smile, and he stood up tall. And I could tell it just made his day.
That's awesome.
It was one of the best feelings I've ever had as a historian, because sometimes you're lucky enough to make the people who you admire smile, or hear their stories, or share them with other people, and that's what I love about history. And now I have to check. How are we doing on time?
You're right on.
I've got 5 after.
Oh, okay, all right on time. Well,
Awesome
I
story.
want to thank you guys very much for coming. I want to thank Uncle Kage for coming, even though we had to step out. I hope you guys have a wonderful convention, and if you guys want to hear a couple more stories and hear us reenact and recount some hilariously inaccurate versions of history, please come to Tipsy Time Machine at 2:30. It's going to be me, Boozy Badger, Alkali, QM, and Iggy. And there may be a drink involved. Thank you guys for coming. Hope you have a good convention.
Silver Gattoman, he bought me a coffee. Silver Gattoman, here is the song for thee. He likes to video all the panels at the cons. You should go and watch them whether they are short or long. Silver Gattoman, you video that's not a jibe. All of you go to his YouTube channel and like and subscribe.